Go ahead and go.
Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. We currently have 76 participants connected, make that 77, and a few more we'll add, I'm sure, as we go on in the next few minutes. This presentation today will be made by Mr. Andy Temeyer, and the topic is sustainable design. He has a few breakouts, as you can see on your screen, as a breakdown of what sustainable design entails. Andy is a registered architect and has been with the Corps of Engineers for over a decade. He is a native Midwesterner, so he's not far from home, having been born and raised in Council Bluffs, Iowa. I did put a little bit of his background in the chat if you would want to refer to it. And if yours is the same as mine, the last part of it got truncated off. He's currently serving as the program manager for the B-21 bed down, which is a major Air Force project. And the focus of that is at Ellsworth Air Force Base. This session is being recorded. When you have questions, please put it in the chat and we will take your questions from there. Please make sure you are on mute, and we will get started. The information, the recording will be available on the same website that the others have been, and we can go from there. Take it away, Andy.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. We've got a lot to go through today, so bear with me. We may go at this at a breakneck pace, and please put your comments in the chat bar and we'll try to get to them where we can. So ultimately, when we teach this, you know, we derive some of these slides from the prospect course that we teach, and this is probably the better part of a day in that course. So lots of stuff to go through, and we'll dive in. So objective that we have today is to describe how high performance sustainable design relates and affects your design process. I struggle with this a little bit nowadays. I feel like I'm becoming an old person, and I don't know, maybe depending on who we have on the line here, this may be business as usual, or it maybe seem like a shift in how traditional design process works. But as far as resources go, the UFC 1202 is your primary point of reference for requirements and criteria. That references the IGCC, formerly known as ASHRAE 189.1, and then you also have your energy requirements that are coming out of ASHRAE 90.1. For projects that are pursuing LEED certification, you have LEED and LEED Online. Then there's obviously also other third-party certification guides and tools and stuff like that, depending on where you're at. We'll talk about AR 421-1, which serves as kind of our overarching guidance for how we proceed through our design process. It's obviously got an Army focus, but we leverage that basic process on other services as well, like Air Force. There's the Mercy website, which we've talked about before, probably needs some updating. It does have some good information in it. If you're working on Air Force projects, there's an AFI 32-1023 for designing and constructing military construction projects. And then don't have to be an architect to look at the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice, but we consistently refer to these design phases as schematic, design development, and construction documentation. Those kind of came out of the AIA long time ago, and so if you're looking to relate basic design process and theory, that's a good resource. We're going to look at the full design process. That's from conceptual and schematic design through design development and then construction documentation. If you guys listened in a couple of weeks ago on the project delivery webinar, we posted this cost impact curve. Many of you have probably seen something like this. So line 1 is your ability to influence a project and then line number 2 is the cost of those changes. So the later in you get into a design or into a project, the higher the ability to impact your project, and it goes down, and then the cost of those impacts goes exponentially higher. We overlay line 3 is what we'd probably label as a traditional design process, where you kind of do a little bit of work, or leading up to a big crush of work in the construction documentation phase, and then it tapers off. Whereas in a more integrated or sustainable design process, we try to front load that work as much as we can. So you're making all your big decisions early when you have the ability to make positive impacts on your project, and then by the time you hit construction documentation phase, we'll cycle back to this, but all of your big decisions are made, and you're just drafting is kind of the overall goal. Obviously, that works in theory, and I'm certain anybody that's been involved in a design project before probably has numerous stories where this isn't how it worked out, but this is what we're ultimately attempting to achieve. Again, whether you looked at listened in on our integrated design or project delivery presentation, this is the basic OSD level flow chart that shows a project timeline for like a Milcon project. You have your guidance here, where the service receives or distributes guidance for planning and programming their projects. And then you also probably initiate 1391 development, your planning shreds, your things like that to help scope the project correctly. Your design year is where we'd pick up on most of what we're going to talk about today. Start with your concept design and your schematic design. You'd probably, we've talked in the last couple of weeks about the OSD process for budget certification. So that would be completed in your design year. Then your design development and construction documentation phase would be completed the year before your target program year, which is usually your program year is the year that you're going to execute your construction contract, or that's the target year that you're going to execute your construction contract. So in this case right now, just as an example, I think if you're on the correct glide path, you're probably trying to complete your 35% designs on FY25 projects right now in FY22 in order to meet your OSD target, and then you'll proceed through the design process through your budget year, which would be next year, and targeting an award in early FY25. Excuse me, FY24. I just misstated that. So you're completing your 35% design in this year in FY22, completing your design in FY23 for a target award in FY24. Okay, so I'm not sure how many people on the phone have spent a lot of time, rummaging through AR 420. Many of you have probably heard of the headquarters USACE directive codes that are often that give us authorization to proceed through different design and execution phases on a project. And so we're going to start with looking at Code 2, which authorizes concept design. I don't know that I understand why Code 2 authorizes you to go to 35% design, but then Code 3 authorizes parametric design, which is a 5 to 15% of the total design effort. But ultimately, a lot of times those codes would apply to your project differently depending on your anticipated acquisition strategy. So early in design, you're going to enter parametric design, which we label as programming, be activated by Code 3 for the AR. You'd start developing, basically, I think we probably label it a 10% concept design, develop a charrette report and a parametric cost estimate. That would all feed into a DD 1391 that your owning organization, the user organization would be responsible for programming. From there, you would proceed into concept or schematic design is what AIA and I believe our UFCs now label it. That would be activated by Code 2 for the AR. And then your 1391 would be approved or certified at the end of that process on the back of 35% design drawings, a 35% cost estimate, and then a design and construction agent certification, which is something we talked about a couple of weeks ago. We're really not going to go into detail on that process, but talk about it a little bit more here shortly. When you're reviewing your programming goals, ultimately, again, this is when we refer back to integrated design, we want to make sure that we have a robust and diverse team working on the project. Your programming shouldn't just be done by a project manager. It should be done and one person at the base or something like that. It should have a robust team, diverse skill set that can vet and validate all of the project requirements and begin that integrated development process. Conduct research as necessary to ensure that you have a project site, that you've properly placed your facilities on the site, that you've identified sustainable features and components that may impact your project scope or budget. Begin to think about low impact development and site development. And then also try to open the aperture a little bit on your project. See what sort of resources are available within or around your project site so that you can make informed and intelligent decisions about how to best develop your project. Set and prioritize goals. Every project is, constrained by scope and budget. Sustainability doesn't remove those constraints. However, early initiation on all of this stuff certainly helps increase the chance for successful delivery of sustainable features on your project. And then you ultimately, during programming, you're going to prepare your programming report that includes a parametric cost estimate and a draft 1391. That cost estimate should include costs for lifecycle cost-effective systems that you've analyzed during this process, and then use that as backup. And potentially, again, when we talk project delivery, I don't believe there's a markup anymore authorized on most Army projects or on any Army projects. There used to be a 2% markup. But ultimately, if you find features or systems to be lifecycle cost effective, those potentially can be programmed into the project. And you would want your report to substantiate or provide backup for that analysis. When you're kicking off your project, sustainable design features and options need to be a part of the conversation. Here's some of the, new, fancy, shiny, big, appealing things that everybody wants to be able to talk about. Everybody wants a windmill on their project, right? I don't know, I'm kind of kidding, but make sure that sustainability is part of the conversation when you kick off your project. What can you do to reduce your energy consumption at the project level? What can you do to reduce your water consumption? There's easy things like low flow faucets and toilets, and then there's more complicated things like rainwater harvesting, purple pipe, all that type of stuff. So we're not here to tell you what to use or what to entertain or what to consider, but you need to look at your individual projects and generate that conversation as early as possible. And it's not too early to start the energy modeling process. That's not to say that you have to have a robust train trace model, or I can't remember the other one that we often use, but start looking at in an iterative manner, working from general to specific, how design decisions impact your project in an energy modeling environment. So, if that means that you use some online tools that do rough building massings, the energy modeling, or using plugins to your BIM model like Revit to do that, but use the best tool for the job, but don't constrain yourself to the idea that Well, we use train trace for energy modeling, so that's where we're going to do this, and it's really a more heavyweight application to use. So we're not going to do energy modeling now because we don't want to invest the time and effort. Figure out what the right tool for the job is, and then use that iterative modeling process to inform your design decisions. You can start looking at daylighting analysis, figure out how your massing and layout, how your fenestration strategy begins to influence your design, your energy consumption, things like that. Again, these are not polished models. These are working models. They're not for compliance or substantiating compliance with ASHRAE 90.1 or anything like that. You're just trying to get an idea of how your decisions are impacting or influencing your path forward. Another example of daylighting using Ecotect, which is, I think, a dead software at this point in time, so maybe we need to update the slide. Start working your third-party certification checklist. This is a LEED version 4 checklist, but most projects, the UFC dictates which projects require third-party certification. Army still is behind LEED, Air Force is not typically, but ultimately start tracking compliance with your third-party certification requirements. UFC is a very strong indicator of what you got to do on your project, but if you need to track LEED certification as well, achieving all of your required, all the credits you're going to need to get to LEED Silver is not going to be 100% coincident with complying with the UFC. So you need to start taking a look at this stuff early and figure out where your gaps are, run a gap analysis, and try to establish where you can target credits that get you in the best position for that silver certification, and maybe factor in a little bit of room for error. Record card documentation. A lot of you might know of these as HPSP Checklist. Each service tends to have their own checklist. I think the Army and the Air Force ones are still posted at this link on the whole building design guide. The Army one is now a PDF, but it's gone through several different versions over time. And I believe the Air Force one is still an Excel spreadsheet. I'd say that the Army one, the degree with which those are being tracked right now is not what it necessarily was in the past. Air Force still pretty consistently asks for them when we execute their projects, but ultimately they should reside with the project files and be available if requested. When you do your design charrette at the beginning of schematic design, again, make sure you retain as much of your PDT from planning as you can. Make sure that you're validating your project requirements against the 1391. At this point in the correct life cycle, that 1391 is still a draft. Your budget shouldn't be locked. Track down your owner's project requirements. Maybe that's defined in your planning charrette report or your PDR. Maybe it's a separate document depending on the complexity of the project. And then also make sure that you understand your base design. See here. The bottom bullet here is starting to get you to think, or is pushing you to get to start thinking about third-party certification process at this stage. Can you complete your integrative process worksheet for LEED compliance at this stage, rather than waiting until you're in construction documentation phase and are rushing to get the project advertised? This is when you probably have your best handle on that integrative process. Completing that worksheet will assure that you're tracking that stuff from design kickoff, and then ultimately it serves as guidance throughout the rest of the design process. I know it's a little bit of additional work early on in the project, but it's probably less than work than trying to figure out what the heck you did, a year later. So, and then trying to document it from there. So, another example is your water budget analysis. It's kind of crazy to me, but we talk about this a lot in the prospect course. You usually at 10% design phase have a pretty good handle on your plumbing fixtures in the building, and you can start taking a look at your water savings calculations and see if you're at a deficit for your target water savings or your required water savings. Again, identify your PDT. Make sure you can retain as much ownership to that project within the PDT as you can. Make sure everybody has access to contact information. If you're doing an in-house design, that's great. A lot of times people are all sitting next to one another, shoulder to shoulder in the building. But this happened before COVID, but it's even more prevalent now. We work with remote teams. We work across geography across the country, and we have diverse team member sets. So make sure everybody knows how to get in contact with one another. And then declare clear roles and responsibilities. Nothing drags a project kind of in the gutter when nobody knows what their job is and what they're responsible for. Try to be clear with where those responsibilities lie. We kind of have a couple of hot topics around our district. Who owns editing certain credits, who owns editing certain specs. Make sure that you know who's going to edit your sustainability spec or your sustainability reporting spec early on, so that it doesn't just get forgotten. You should have your project manager. Make sure that they understand that sustainability requirements are a requirement on the project. They're not an option. Do what we can to make sure that they have the ability to communicate with stakeholders outside of your organization, and then provide them with the analysis and tools to help execute on project requirements. There's an ECB that came out a couple of years ago, and I think this is reinforced in the ER at this point, but make sure you have a design team lead. They're their day-to-day proponent for the project. Make sure they know who they are and what their responsibilities are, and that they're acting as a conduit to resolve project level issues for coordination and between disciplines, and are continually evaluating the project for compliance. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to be the one that's doing all the sustainability documentation, but a lot of times they'll need to be running interference on that front. I think sometimes this gets forgotten about. Make sure your design supervisor structure has an awareness of sustainability requirements on your project. Ensure that they have the best understanding. A lot of first-line supervisors, they may not be in the weeds on compliance with ASHRAE or compliance with documenting third-party certification, but it's an important part of the project. It directly relates to project success, and if your supervisory staff don't at least have a basic level of understanding of these requirements, it increases the risk that the quality of how you're going to deliver on that. Number one is inconsistent. Number two, increases risk that you miss expectations. So do what you can to include sustainability compliance as part of your quality control procedures. Review your energy model. Review any third-party certification templates or documentation that you've completed. Make sure that stuff is being done early and is being maintained rather than forgotten about again to the last minute. Cursor here. Again, this is a slide where we talk about the OSD. We refer to this as the Lord Memo, which established a pretty rigid methodology for how we deliver projects nowadays. OSD, I think, kind of identified that projects were continually behind the curve as far as what the ideal delivery timeline was. So ultimately what this policy does is it establishes that you begin design of your project relatively early to what we would consider normal, or actually on time, according to that execution timeline we talked about earlier. But if you develop your project design at 35% to an industry standard level, that's defined by this AACE RP 56R08. You develop your cost estimate to that same standard, and then conduct, at this point, I think it's all MILCON projects, FY24 and beyond, a cost and schedule risk analysis consistent with AHCE RP 41R08. That allows your the budget owner, the project owner, to go to OSD and adjust their project budget. I don't know how much collective experience we have with this process on the line today, but I guess working the B21 program, this is becoming very, very common, and we've had fairly good success completing this. You check all these boxes, and at 35% design, we're in the right spot for the Air Force to go back and change their budgets with a better developed design and a better developed cost estimate. Here's the certification document. I think this form's been updated since we last projected this. There's different versions of this form. This slide here. But ultimately, make design decisions early. Start thinking about how your design decisions are going to integrate with other systems, and start running some interference on that. Think about, this is an example, but how wall color may impact your lighting strategy, how that may impact your mechanical room or your mechanical design or your mechanical room solution. Think about how certain, in this case, I think we're looking at a wall and how we're going to insulate, and how, electrical system routing and infrastructure can be installed within that wall assembly, and whether that has an impact on the thermal performance of your project. Here's another example of an integrated solution, solar tubes. We've used these a lot within our district, but they provide fairly cheap way to deliver daylight into spaces that otherwise may not have good opportunities for, things like skylights or clear stories or big walls of translucent or transparent fenestration. All right, so as you wrap up schematic design, you should have your record card, you should have your design drawings, a design analysis. Your sustainability analysis may be part of your design analysis, but make sure that you're starting to document all of the commitments that the team has started to make in meeting minimum or life cycle requirements, and then include any life cycle cost analysis that backs up your decisions. Okay, so that puts us, I don't know if you guys can see my cursor very well, but that puts you right at, that puts you at your middle of your, or end of your design year. That's where you're going to complete your DCA certification. Hopefully, if you did everything correctly, your service is going to be able to adjust their budget and set your project up to have the right amount of scope and money backing your project. That gives you actually a fairly luxurious timeline to awarding within your program year. That means that design development and construction documentations, you usually have about an entire year or more to work the remainder of your design. Obviously, all of this is contingent on your acquisition strategy. I believe the OSD reporting requirement is the same whether you go design build or design bid build, but what your remaining design phases may change from here on out. Okay, so design development. Your basic goal during design development is to build your schematic design from a set of goals and a set of analyses into a coordinated solution that you can build and run all of the coordination and interference that you can do during this phase to assure that you can produce a reliable set of design documents. As I was saying, this would typically be activated by a code 6 for like a 100% design or a full design, whether that's AE or in-house. Code 7 would be for design build RFP, or code 2 would be for an adapt build methodology. But ultimately, your path to a construction contract award will obviously be different from this point forward, whether if you go design build versus design bid build. But ultimately, we're still going to be tracking similar goals. All right. Again, here's your cost impact curve. Design development is very hard to see. It's the third marker here. But as you can see, we're already past the peak of where we've got our level of effort. We're trying to do coordination. We've made all of the big strategic goals early, and we're just trying to do the coordination that we can so that we can produce a reliable set of contract documents. I think it's important to say or be open to the idea that high performance sustainable design is more work than what we'd maybe label a non-high performance design methodology or process. The whole idea of this is that we spend a little bit more time in design to yield long-term payback for a life cycle cost-effective facility. That puts a burden on the PDT, everyone involved, whether that you're doing design or project management, or maybe you're on the owner-operator side of the table. But ultimately, I think we have to be willing to say that out loud. That may mean that you have to make difficult decisions on what you're going to focus on. Maybe your design budget isn't going to increase, but ultimately we have to be willing to figure out how to deliver on these requirements, knowing that it may require a little bit more analysis or effort to yield a successful outcome. Cycling back to the topic of integrated design, figure out what tools and resources may facilitate this collaboration process. Within Omaha District, we have a space labeled the BIM pit. It's not used as often, frankly, now that we have all of these virtual coordination tools, but figure out ways to get your designers in the same space, whether that's real property or virtual, and actively work coordination on your design. Figure out what, again, back to BIM, is BIM the correct tool to facilitate that? I would argue that it is, but there's all kinds of tools and resources out there available, and depending on what you're attempting to coordinate, use the best tool for the job. We already talked about BIM. I think most districts at this point are probably using BIM, whether that's a Bentley or an Autodesk product. This is not a sales pitch for one piece of software or another, but again, the whole concept of BIM is that you're modeling a facility in virtual reality. I think it's pretty well understood at this point in time that utilizing BIM typically requires a pretty front-loaded effort, similar to the entire process that we're talking about, to feed that environment with all of the inputs that are necessary so that you can facilitate an integrated and coordinated design process. I think that depending where you are in adopting BIM within your district, that you may feel like that the payback isn't there, but I think the more and more that you learn how to take advantage of the BIM process, you can start to realize benefits on the back end for reduced errors and emissions, for opportunities for I don't know, use a flowery word, synergies in design detailing or design system or in systems coordination, things like that. Okay, so you're going to circle back to our energy modeling. You're going to finalize your concept models, start working your compliance models. Those may or may not be developed within the same systems. The same people may not be responsible for those. Not going to dictate who those are, but all of a sudden you're starting to transition focus on using energy modeling to make design decisions, to facilitating energy modeling to show compliance with all of the requirements that we've established. And try to make sure that those models are available for the entire PDT, whether that means it's outputs or summaries or tables or whatever. Make sure that the whole team understands the inputs that are going into those so that they're as accurate as possible. Design development, I think with the increased focus on high performance design, it's worth asking the question, how do we present the work we've done? I sometimes feel like you can go through this whole phase, do a huge amount of coordination, make a lot of decisions, and then you find yourself burdened with, oh, I'm trying to meet my standard 65% design deliverable requirements. And I don't feel like I'm there yet. You just put all this time into building a BIM model, but you don't feel like you have the correct output. Again, not here to dictate what your deliverables are, but I think it's worth thinking about, and maybe drawing specs in a DA aren't the best ways to communicate that. How do you reconcile the expectation for what everybody considers to be a standard 65% deliverable versus giving the PDT and your stakeholders the best information they can have to show what you've done in order to meet their requirements? If you had to put a finger on what your standard deliverables would be, probably be a cartooned construction document set. So you're getting a handle on how many sheets you need to communicate what you need to communicate. You're starting to pull individual specifications, compiling them, starting to edit them, have a design analysis that addresses all your sustainability requirements. You're starting to select features and products or performance requirements for products that go into your project, and then updated record card for HPSP checklist. So the overarching goal through design development is that you're making all of your design decisions that impact other disciplines during this phase. And that basically translates into, as you transition into construction documents, the construction documentation goal. Compile and complete contract documents with enough detail that they can execute a construction contract. This may seem overly simplified, or it may seem completely unrealistic depending on what your perspective is, but ultimately the goal is by the time you hit CD phase, you're drafting. And obviously you're gonna always have little things that come up to coordinate, but you don't wanna be rethinking strategies at this stage that impact a variety of other design disciplines. This is about trying to stay in your lane as much as you possibly can, reduce the amount of coordination required at this phase, because again, going back to that cost impact curve, it's much more difficult at this phase, and you're gonna have higher proportionate costs to make changes at this phase than if you would have made those decisions earlier. Again, get my cursor up here. Here's your construction documentation phase. The overall pace is starting to trend down as you try to develop construction documents. And again, if you look at this line 2, the later you get, the higher you're seeing exponential growth in the cost of design changes at this point. So you want to minimize that as much as possible. Any remaining coordination would be within your discipline. Okay, so deliverables. You need drawings, usually delivered by a combination of BIM, building information modeling, CIM, which is civil information modeling, and or CAD. You have specifications to include all of your sustainability specifications. One of the key ones there is 013329 with submittal register and attachments that properly communicate your sustainability, commissioning, and third-party certification requirements. You start developing all of your, or not start, but complete your sustainability documentation. Make sure that's either part of the design analysis or a separate attachment. And then one thing that it always seems to be a last thought, but I think is really important for sustainable project delivery is instructions to field personnel. Make sure you communicate in your design analysis or separately what unique systems or features are going to require additional consideration during construction. So sustainability sometimes means that we're considering alternative systems that may not be considered normal or require a little bit of additional oversight during construction. And this is where you want to let your field personnel know, your resident offices and such, that they need to take a little bit of more care or scrutinize those systems or features so that your holistic design intent is executed properly. Some examples of drawings and details, nothing sacred about any of these, but these were air barrier. How do we properly communicate air barrier boundaries and detailing? In this case, we were trying to show where different boundaries in section occur within the project, and then tie those back to specific, or not specific, typical details on how to apply or establish your air barrier boundary. Again, nothing sacred about these details, but trying to communicate intent for continuity of insulation. On your specifications, I think there's a lot of value in communicating intent to make sure that your sustainable goals are achieved. If it's sometimes easy to write a performance specification, but think about whether somebody that doesn't know the amount of effort that you've gone in trying to coordinate something understands what you're trying to do. If that's not clear, figure out how to communicate it, whether that's a drawing, whether that's additional language. If the best you can offer is an intent statement, my intent is to do this, figure out the best place to state it and get it in the contract documents. May not be the most enforceable thing in the whole world, but it's better than nothing. Make sure your specs include your lead checklist if your project has to pursue lead, and then make sure you have all your corresponding reference specifications. I think the bio-based products is now part of the 013329, possibly also construction waste management, but total building commissioning is definitely a standalone spec, and that needs to be edited to your specific commissioning requirements on your project. When you're editing your sustainability reporting spec, make sure you identify who your third-party certification entity is. Typically going to be LEED or GBI or GBCI, but it could be a variety of other entities depending on, or other strategies could be required depending on who your project is for. Clearly identify if there's, say, credits in LEED that the contractor is responsible for. Make sure they understand what's their responsibility and what may be the AE's responsibility or the Corps' responsibility. Attach the checklist to your contract, and then also attach your HPSP checklist because that needs to be maintained through construction. There's different ways that you can address submittals in your specifications. Sometimes we include a statement in our material specs that talks about, hey, this project has sustainability requirements. See your sustainability requirements spec for more information. There's also the S submittals designation. I know we've talked about that as somewhat of a controversial thing from time to time, but the UFC technically requires it. And the S designation, for those that aren't tracking, is where you designate a submittal to be part of your sustainability notebook. During construction documentation, make sure your design analysis includes descriptions of all your sustainable systems. Make sure your intent is clearly communicated, whether the contractor is typically not going to see your design analysis, but maybe your field personnel will crack it open, and it'll help document where you guys were trying to head with a system or a strategy or a feature of the project, and then describe how systems need to coordinate with one another, if that's applicable. I know air barrier installation and detailing always seems to be, it doesn't matter how many drawings you draw, there's always going to be one-off conditions, and those are things that are going to have to be coordinated in the field after the fact. I'm sure that's the case with all kinds of other engineered systems. And that can, again, be manifested in instructions to field personnel. Right? Coordination goal, we've talked about this before, but if done correctly, your CD phase is a drafting effort. All right, so that gets you all the way through your budget year, and that puts you in a position to solicit and award a project early in your program FY. So familiar quotes from construction documentation phase, just a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I don't want to, I don't know how to. Start to see a lot of excuses. Everybody's feeling the pressure of getting a design kicked out. How do you begin to address these things? You're running low on design funds. I think it's really important to emphasize that our industry is continually changing. The way that we deliver projects and the way that we specify things and the amount of and the level of effort with which we detail or go about contracting things should respond to how our entire collective environment is changing. So, you know, do you need to draw that roof detail? It seems more and more we're specifying roofs as they're almost a performance spec anymore, you know, for basic roofs. Do you need to draw every single parapet condition? Are there details that you're drawing that take time, that provide minimal effort? Could that time be spent conveying intent or specifying something else? I'm not here to arbitrate what or defend what you should or shouldn't do. I think it's important to think about that as you put pen to paper or clicking a mouse. What value, instead of just drawing the easiest detail, what value does that detail provide in delivering a functional facility that meets all of your requirements? Here's another one. We can't do X on this project because, well, that maybe sometimes is stated rhetorically, but I think it's important to ask the question. If you feel like you're being constrained for a reason, make sure you ask somebody else. Make sure you ask somebody else that has the potential to influence the way that you go about doing that stuff. Look for opportunities. If you guys, if you don't have expertise within district, look for opportunities for inter-district coordination. We have a lot of resources throughout the Corps, a lot of people that know a lot of diverse and unique things. See if you can figure out who may be interested in helping your projects succeed on that front where you guys are facing challenges. Work with your STD leads, your sustainability leads within your district. Not only within your district, but within your, maybe start with your division, and then you can work up from there. And then also think about alternate contracting strategies. What are ways to incentivize meeting your project requirements that don't just fall within the exact same contracting methodology you used on the last project? Maybe you do that slowly and iteratively over time, project by project, but don't turn off the idea that that you can incrementally improve on the way that you deliver your projects. Here's another fun question. Why are we focused on lead when the project was underfunded and poorly scheduled in the first place? Well, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's a project requirement. It's part of the DoD building code as defined in the UFCs. If your project triggers that threshold for requiring lead or third-party certification, it's just as important as compliance with the rest of the UFCs. And so this all ties back to a focus on high performance design and delivering high quality facilities for the military, so or other partners, so that they have the best facilities that operate over their life cycle, not the best facilities that operate the first 2 or 3 years of the project. Taking a different approach to in defining the bottom line for your project. It includes the entire project life cycle, not just your first cost. All right, so that was a lot. I think we have a couple of comments up here. We have a few minutes, but ultimately our goal today was to describe how high performance sustainable design relates and affects the design process. We're trying to follow through on the goals that were established when we planned the project. We're investigating design intent early and at a high degree of investigation early on, so that to assure that when we get later in the project, we can retain compliance with those goals. You use the OFD and the DCA process through the LORD memo to your project's advantage. If you hit those milestones, the chances for you being able to adjust your budget at 35% design are certainly significantly greater than if you don't hit those targets. Identify and coordinate interdisciplinary design features during design development to minimize the amount of coordination that's required when you're trying to crank out a set of contract documents. And then as you hit construction documentation phase, make sure that you enforce your sustainability requirements and goals in your contract documents. All right, that was a lot. Ned, I don't know if you've been tracking any questions.
There's only one question that's come up in the chat, and I'll get to that in just a second, but I did want to add the very last point you made. Why do we have LEED when the budget's all way out of whack and so forth? Originally, sustainability, not just LEED, was all about the environment and the need to do that, and sometimes how the environment was shortchanged because of budget or because it was an important project or this or that. Sustainability then extended into being about the occupants or the human factors, the people within. And when you boil something down to a cost factor, if you look at just the occupants and consider a very small fraction of 1% of their productivity, typically called white collar productivity, which is very hard to track, that'll not only pay for the sustainability, but the whole building many times over the life of the building. So if we do a good job on sustainability, and you can look at each of the individual factors, whether it's in the guiding principles, whether it's in the LEED, the idea is that we have not only a more productive workforce in the building, but altruistically, the workforce is better off. And with that, sorry about getting on the soapbox, but that's something that I've come across many times in my career anyway. We do have a question from Marilyn Scott. It has to do with comparison of the UFC and LEED, and if I could extend that comparison to the guiding principles requirements. And to answer that, maybe you have it handy. There has been one done. It'd take me a while, or it's actually been done more than once. But to lay our hands on it quickly, can't refer to it. Also, a comment that I put in, you referred to design LEED and where that was. It is in an engineering construction bulletin from 2015, which would normally be out of date, but it has been extended multiple times up to 10 September. So from that standpoint, the design LEED, as you referred to in the UFC, is referred to as a technical LEED. From that, we've had several more questions come in the chat. Can you see those also, Andy?
Yeah, so I don't have it documented. There's an ECB that came out last fall, so that would have been 2021. I think it's 2021-12. I don't know if some, but that contained some documentation that could be considered, at least a partial gap analysis for LEED version 4. But I would say, you know, generically, every time a new LEED version comes out, whether it's headquarters or Searle, they typically will conduct some sort of gap analysis that crosswalks current UFC requirements, attempts to determine whether the UFC needs to be changed, and then ultimately, it doesn't necessarily help you solve all of your individual unique project problems, but it may provide some sort of indicator on whether that credit is maybe a reliable credit to track for on a quote unquote typical project. So that would be where I'd start. But I think you ultimately can't just rely on those programmatic or service level gap analysis. You're going to need to start taking a look at that at your project level early and often to make sure that you're tracking compliance. Jason's questions about design analysis considered BOD. I know we've talked about in the prospect course before. I think that somewhat depends on how you develop your design analysis, but I would say it's not too far-fetched to think that your planning documents may serve or could serve as an owner's project requirements, and your design analysis could serve as a BOD. But make sure that you're tracking all the requirements for all of that stuff. I don't know, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this. I don't really care what it's labeled as long as the information is there and that it's available to the right people. Let's see here. Yeah. So any other questions?
Not a question, but an additional comment to support what you've done. In working in the past with the tri-service group that is responsible for the technical aspects of 1-200-02, the sustainability UFC, they do look at LEED and the guiding principles to make sure that things are consistent, even if there's different guidelines from the Army aspect versus the Air Force aspect and so forth. That doesn't mean that they take LEED and then put that in the UFC. That's kind of backwards. But from the standpoint of what's important is in the UFC. So that's a good guiding document, and working with LEED will get you pretty much there, but a review of the requirements and the checklists and so forth that have been prepared will make sure that you have things covered, because there is an awful lot of details for anyone to remember to consider. And the checklists are there not just to check something off, but to help remind people that what's important and why it's important. Over.
Yeah, I mean, as you track LEED versus the UFC over time, you know, LEED version 2 or 2.2 versus the UFC. Well, the UFC didn't even really exist necessarily in the way that it does now during a good chunk of that time. LEED version 3, there was probably, I don't know, 80–85% overlap between the LEED credits and the UFC requirements that we would typically track. As you get into LEED version 4, I think that has started to diverge again. It's more difficult to meet LEED credential and certification requirements than it is to comply with the minimum set of UFC requirements. So ultimately, this is all about keeping everything in front of you, that you're continually thinking about it, you're comparing, and you're not forgetting that, hey, if I just blindly comply with the UFC, am I or am I not going to get the LEED credit that corresponds with that? You may need to do something a little bit different or document something a little bit different way to assure that you hit all your requirements for your credits. And I think that's kind of hitting us hard throughout the core right now on LEED version 4 projects. That ECB that I referenced, I think it came out because there's a growing trend of not meeting our LEED version 4 credential or certification requirements. So
For silver.
Again, just trying to reinforce, yes, for silver, which again is more difficult. So the likelihood that you succeed, it's not surprising that it's becoming more difficult. I think it's understood that version 4 silver is a much higher it's much more difficult to achieve on a standard project than a corresponding LEED version 2009 silver. That bar is always raising.
We used to have several platinum projects coming up every once in a while, and now it's hard to get silver. So the bar is apparently changing.
Yes.
Just to notice, since we're a couple minutes past the hour, we peaked at 105 people, if I noted that correctly, and appreciate everybody taking the time. I felt it's worthwhile. And even though I've been involved in this quite a long time, I keep learning things, working with the team, and appreciate Andy's background, learning from him. Anything else, Andy? Or we're ready to
Nope.
Daniel,
Thanks,
any
everybody. Have a
words
great day, and we'll see everybody at the next webinar.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, appreciate it.